I know that one of the first things that served as a catalyst for you to get into neuro work and brain health was social anxiety in your earlier years. And through the process of the self-learning that you started engaging in, you were able to really improve your verbal fluency and become more comfortable in social situations. Take us back to that period in your life and just kind of talk a little bit about what you were learning early on and then some of the results that you started seeing as you dug deeper into this field.
Kind of like taking, a perspective of like my early childhood. I grew up with a single mom, was the only child. So I always thought, kind of like I had just a lack of socializing, kind of compared to maybe other kids. So I always just growing up, like I always struggled socially. I always excelled academically. I was a smart kid, but I was super shy. And as I got into middle school, high school, I became like, I was very like socially awkward and struggled with a lot of social anxiety just in any situation, whether that was, just talking to other kids in the class, especially when it came to girls. And I knew that was, it was my main problem in my life. So it was something that at some point I came to the realization that this was the result of how my brain was functioning on a biological level rather than who I actually was deep down as a person. Meaning Toby as a person is not socially anxious and awkward. That was a result of the way my brain was functioning because I was not verbally fluent. I was always grasping for words. I was always, felt just very uptight and anxious, I think, in social situations because I could never think of what I was trying to say. I could never get the thoughts in my head out into words when I was speaking to people. So I came off as very robotic, and that really killed a lot of my social interactions. So this was around, the high school, I think, junior year of high school, I started getting into the biohacking space, started reading Dave Asprey's Bulletproof blog back in the early days of that. And, just learning more about kind of psychology and neuroscience. I had a lot of curiosity just about how the brain works because I wanted to be able to change and improve my own brain because I sort of saw that as the route to conquer my social anxiety.
Yeah.
So as I got into college, I was still struggling a lot with those problems, but I started working at a research lab, actually measuring people's brainwave activity. So the electrical activity that the brain uses to communicate with itself can actually be measured with a test called an EEG. This is something that's been used back since the 1930s. But basically, our brainwave activity is one of the main drivers, in addition to the neurotransmitters, but it's one of the main drivers of our thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and really all of our cognitive abilities, whether we feel calm and relaxed in social situations or whether we feel nervous and flustered, has a lot to do with the regulation of our brainwaves. So as I was learning that and kind of started to play around with some of the brain training modalities to help stabilize and improve my brainwave activity, specifically something called neurostimulation, which is basically not nearly as scary as it sounds. I know some people hear neurostimulation and they think about, the 1960s, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the kind of electroshock therapy. But actually neurostimulation today uses like a very low intensity electrical current to stimulate specific areas of the brain, improve blood flow and oxygenation, and improve neurogenesis, so the growth and creation of new neurons, new connections amongst cells in the brain. So I was able to find with my initial brain map, which is a measurement of my brainwave activity, I was able to see that one of the areas as part of the left frontal lobe, an area of the brain that's really in charge of verbal fluency, was really underactive. So by stimulating that area over the course of doing these neurostimulation sessions on myself, I started noticing, like from the first session I did, I started noticing that I'd be on a phone call with someone, and instead of like thinking really hard about what I was trying to say and grasping for words, I just started feeling more natural and just saying whatever was on my mind, and just kind of having more of the verbal fluency that was more normal. And as I did more and more sessions, I just started noticing that started to become not just a temporary period of time during the sessions, but it started actually becoming my new baseline. So as I improved my verbal fluency a lot, I just started naturally feeling so much more comfortable in social situations because I was able to express, my true self. I was able to be my authentic self, and without that sort of impediment of the verbal fluency issues that I was experiencing. So, I just started flourishing in social situations, started having the friendships that I wanted to have, the deep connections, and dating became a lot easier. So yeah, man, it really changed my life. And that was at the same time that I was working with clients and patients going through substance abuse, mental health issues, all sorts of different things that I was seeing them benefit from their issues as well. So it was kind of like a personal journey of experiencing my own brain changing and improving on a biological level and seeing how that benefited my life so much, but then also witnessing that in so many other people that kind of solidified, my desire to do this really as a career.
I read Limitless by Jim Quick last summer, and one of the biggest takeaways that I walked away from with that book is this idea that the brain that we're born with is not necessarily the brain that we're destined to have for the rest of our life, and that you can actually improve and change the settings of your brain. And I think your story illustrates that just perfectly. But I'm curious from your perspective and based on what you know about how the brain works, can you kind of talk a little bit about environment versus heredity or genetics? Like how much of our cognitive processing and just the way that we think has to do with how we were raised, maybe those childhood experiences, and in the environment that we're surrounded in now versus the way that we're pre-programmed based on our factory settings, and how do you go about making those adjustments?
Yeah, that's really the $1 million question right there, Michael. I mean, I think that, from research, like on looking at adverse childhood experiences, so kids experience some kind of major trauma within the family or to themselves, they do have much higher rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance abuse, suicide, like all of these things they experience to a way higher degree than someone without those, adverse childhood experiences later on. Yeah. So there definitely is something to be said about what we experience growing up in those formative years and how that shapes our brain, in terms of on a genetic level. I think there are certain, disorders people are born with, like such as autism, that regardless of the experiences that they may have, that this is something that's like a genetic factor that's sort of limiting, their cognition. Mm-hmm. But I think so many things that a lot of people experience, anxiety, depression, brain fog, trauma, or, PTSD, all of these things, there's so many triggers for, kind of the epigenetic changes. So different experiences that we go through that actually change and alter the activity and the expression of our genes, I think is really the main thing that kind of drives people's cognitive health issues. But the beauty of epigenetics is that, you can change your genes, certain things can change your genes for the worse, but then once we know what those epigenetic triggers or switches are, we can also improve the way our genes are functioning. And this ties right into neuroplasticity. So up until like a few decades ago, neuroscientists didn't even think that the brain was capable of changing and rewiring itself. They thought that as we grew up, our brains, throughout adolescence, our brains kind of solidified, and that as we aged, we just, drank heavily, did drugs, that our brain cells just started kind of dying off. But what we now know is that people's brains are constantly changing. Neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, the growth and creation of new neurons, new connections amongst those cells, that's a process that takes place throughout someone's entire life. So if we know kind of how to elicit those changes, then really I think so many of people's mental health issues or brain performance issues really can be greatly improved, if not solved. Yes. And I know that's a statement that is going to run contrary to what a lot of people have heard, from people in the mental health field, as far as like I've worked with a lot of clients and patients who've kind of been told that, they're always going to suffer from depression, or they're always going to have to manage their anxiety. And that is only true until they've kind of been able to figure out how to improve the biological functioning of their brain to the point that they no longer have to manage those symptoms. So it's something that I think I feel very passionately about, that the majority of people's mental health issues at this point, if they know how to kind of influence that neuroplasticity and change their brain in the right direction, that they can at least greatly improve them.
I started learning about brainwave states and flow as a result of my own awakening. And I wanted to ask you, just from a high level, to talk a little bit about the different brainwave states that exist, and then to share one or two tactics and also the times that we should look to be in each of those when they're most useful based on what we're trying to achieve day to day.
So basically these different brainwave patterns, it's kind of the how fast or slow that the brain is running or communicating with itself. So these different brain waves are categorized based on their frequency. How many times per second are they firing? So, you talk about flow states. So flow, there's a kind of electrochemical signature of flow states. Stephen Kotler, huge fan of his work. I don't know if you've come across, like, Rise of Superman is one of my favorite books, highly recommended to people just learning about kind of the neurochemistry of flow. But in flow states, we sync from our normal brainwave pattern, which for most people, you and I, Michael, having this interaction right now, we're mainly producing beta brainwaves. Beta is our normal, alert, awake, focused state.
Okay.
And we spend the majority of our days within beta. But when we enter into a flow state where we get completely absorbed in the present moment, we're super, just there in whatever we're doing. We're not thinking about what meeting we have later in the day, or, whether that girl is going to call us back. Like, we're just completely focused in the moment. Our brainwaves slow down into alpha and even into theta. So alpha is basically one step down from beta. Alpha waves are associated with relaxation. They're kind of an idling rhythm of the brain. But then theta states too. Theta is like a deep state of relaxation. A lot of emotional processing takes place there. These sort of like aha moments, these like integrative experiences that change the way we see ourselves, the situations we're in life, really helping, kind of rewire our subconscious. Because alpha and theta, you can sort of think of, I don't know if you've seen like the iceberg analogy of like the conscious versus the subconscious mind. So like when we kind of map that onto the brainwave states, you can think of like the tip of the iceberg that's like, visible out of the water. That's kind of our beta brainwave pattern, the conscious mind. But then down below the surface, which we know is making up, somewhere they estimate between like 95 to like 98% of, our cognition is subconscious. So in that kind of state below the surface, we have our alpha, theta, and then even down into delta. Delta waves are like the deepest, slowest of the brainwave patterns that are normally produced when we're completely asleep. They're associated with just complete unconsciousness. But a really interesting thing that they found in studies on like advanced meditators, they looked at the brainwave activity of Tibetan monks. This was a series of studies done at the University of Wisconsin by Dr. Richie Davidson. And they basically found that advanced meditators were able to actually access a waking delta state. Okay. So they were able to slow their brainwaves down into such a slow, deep brainwave pattern that most people only access when they're completely unconscious. And research has linked delta, being able to access that kind of conscious delta activity, to people who are highly persuasive, great leaders, and almost able to like kind of manipulate the subconscious. So all of these brainwave states, they're all, we're basically producing all of these brainwaves at all times, but it's the proportion of which we're producing each one that is relevant. So like, for instance, when we're awake, when we're focused, when we're reading something, we're mainly producing beta waves. Mm-hmm. And then, when we're trying to, we're slowing our brainwaves into, say, meditation or sleep, we slow our brains down into alpha. Then light sleep is more so theta, and then deep sleep is getting into delta. So I always tell people none of the brainwaves are good or bad per se. Yeah. They all serve important functions. And the key is really being able to access the brainwave pattern that is relevant to the task at hand. So for instance, like people with ADHD, they usually have a significant overproduction of theta waves, that slower brainwave. It's associated with drowsiness and a mind-wandering brain fog, just kind of a hazy, kind of trance-like state. And that's a state that is super beneficial to get into, doing meditation, breath work. We've found with the breathwork studies, some of the ones that we've done with Anton, where, people are able to enter into these alpha and theta brainwave patterns. And that's really beneficial when it comes to doing those exercises to rewire the subconscious mind. But if you're trying to be able to focus and your brain is kicking up all of these theta waves, you're going to really struggle. So in the same way, when you're trying to relax, and, I work with a lot of executives and, people, kind of very type A, high power people who are just getting stuff done all day. They're mainly, producing these high beta waves. And it's great for their productivity. But then when they're trying to relax and de-stress at night after work, they're trying to just go home to their family. They can't, because they're stuck in that high beta state, which is only useful when they're trying to get stuff done. But when they're trying to slow down, relax, they need to be able to enter into those slower brainwaves that they really struggle with. So it's all about, being able to access the brainwave pattern that's relevant, dependent on what we're doing.
So the goal isn't necessarily to be able to shift into beta or even delta at the snap of a fingers based on just the desire to do so, nor should the intention be to live in those slower brainwave states, all day, every day. It should be to be able to be flexible and to allow the brain to adjust based on whatever you're doing.
Exactly. I mean, the sign of a healthy nervous system is its ability to oscillate between all of these different brainwave patterns. When people are stuck, when they experience symptoms, anxiety, depression, PTSD, they're usually locked into a certain state, and their brain isn't as flexible. So when we're healthy, our nervous systems are healthy, we're able to really just flow into and out of each of the brainwave states whenever is, for whatever is required.
At NuroFlex, your company, you help people who want to do this work, who want to get the absolute most out of their brain. Walk me through your system and the process that somebody would take or should take from where they are now to maybe just getting to that next level. And what are some realistic timeframes that you coach people on to expect in terms of improvement for their cognitive function?
Basically, the initial step is doing a brain map. So the brain map is basically a measurement of your brainwave activity. It's not giving any external input to the brain, telling it to change it anyway. It's simply recording what the brain is already doing. So we do this initial baseline with this swim cap looking device called an EEG cap. So it's a non-invasive way to measure your brain waves. Basically, I put this cap on, I squirt some gel into each of the electrodes with a blunt tip needle. Always looks a bit scary, but I always tell people I'm not injecting anything. It's just a blunt tip needle that's squirting some gel into each of the electrodes, making sure we have a good connection. And then on my computer, I'm picking up those brainwave signals. So the reason that we do this is to get that baseline so we understand where someone's at, which areas of the brain they may be deficient or overactive in each of the 5 major brainwave patterns. So, there's a very famous psychiatrist, Dr. Daniel Amen, who does some brain imaging work with SPECT scans, which are similar, but a bit different than the work I do. But they're definitely correlated. His is mainly looking at blood flow and oxygenation, whereas brain mapping is looking more at the electrical side of things. But he says that, psychiatry or psychiatrists are the only medical profession that don't actually examine the organ in which they're treating. And how do you know unless you look? Meaning, if 2 people are depressed and they're both reporting the same symptoms, that doesn't mean that their brains actually look the same. For one person, they may have dysregulated frontal lobes. For instance, they might have, deficits in beta waves in their frontal lobes, whereas the next person with depression, the issue may be overproduction of alpha in the temporal lobes. So it's really essential in my work doing that initial brain map so that we're able to identify which are the problematic brain waves and in what areas of the brain is that dysregulation occurring. Because for most people, because the majority of the people I work with, they're, pretty successful. They already have good brains. They're just looking to make them great. Yes. So for a lot of people, a lot of different areas of their brain are working pretty well. They're working great. But there's certain areas that may be working suboptimally. So once we're able to identify those areas, we can customize a brain training protocol to really optimize their brains. So it's kind of based on partly, the data, what we're seeing as far as which networks in the brain may not be communicating well, looking at, we look at a lot of different metrics, how both hemispheres of the brain are communicating, whether there's asymmetry between the left and right hemisphere, the coherence between different networks, how different areas are sending signals, the speed of those signals between different areas. So we're looking at a lot of different metrics, and we're training people to improve the biological functioning of their brain based on the data, but then also based on their cognitive health goals. So I work with clients, some of whom are really wanting to improve their ability to focus and concentrate, and others that are really looking to be able to improve their relaxation or get better deep sleep at night.
Right.
So I really like personalize each of the brain training protocols to each client's unique neurophysiology, along with what they're hoping to be able to achieve from the training. But basically, after that initial brain map, I start working with people doing this, usually a 2-month brain optimization program we offer, which involves that initial brain map. And then we do 10 brain training sessions, usually over the course of 5 weeks. So these sessions consist of a variety of different modalities that, for instance, infrared light therapy or brain photobiomodulation. This is a way to increase cellular energy production in the brain. We use neurofeedback, which helps regulate your brainwave activity, neurostimulation, which helps drive neurogenesis, the growth and creation of those new neurons, new connections amongst those cells.
Yep.
And then also audiovisual entrainment, which helps increase the production of some pleasurable neurochemicals like serotonin, which boosts mood, norepinephrine, which increases your ability to focus, and then also really turns on that parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest response. So it puts people in a really deep meditative state, helps slow their brain waves down, and helps really restore functionality to the brain and body. So we kind of cycle people through these different modalities, kind of in the same way as if you were to go work out at the gym. You might hop on the treadmill, and then you might chest press, and then you might leg press. You cycle through these different modalities to train your body. So that's kind of the same approach that we take in terms of training people's brains.
Right.
It's kind of all of these different modalities. We'll kind of layer in a few into each of the sessions. And the reason we do 10, or at least we start with 10 sessions, is because neuroplasticity is a process that takes time of reinforcing, basically helping train people's brains to rewire themselves. And the brain doesn't always want to rewire itself. The brain is actually looking for its homeostasis. Even if homeostasis is a dysfunctional, dysregulated state, it feels safe because that's what our brain is used to. Yeah. So really, your brain starts making these positive changes in the right direction from the very first session we do. But if I was to just, if someone was to just do 1 or 2 sessions, they might feel better in the moment, but their brain's going to quickly just revert back to that homeostatic state. Kind of in the same way, if Michael, if you weren't regularly exercising and, you go to the gym, and it doesn't matter how hard you go at the gym, like you're not going to wake up the next morning looking like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. It takes time to change and improve your physique. So same deal with the brain. That's why we start people, I don't work with people doing, on a session by session basis. It's kind of takes this commitment of at least starting with those 10 sessions in order for people to see really long lasting, durable changes in their brainwave activity. It translates to improved focus, mood, memory, stress, sleep, all of those things. So that's kind of the process that I take people through. But in conjunction with that, we're also really dialing. So in the same way with the brain, the brain training modalities that we work with are really powerful, but the basics of people's brain health, the fundamentals of brain health come down to getting good sleep, having, brain healthy nutrition, getting sunlight, exercise, like all of these things are super important. So there's a lot of coaching involved in the program. So really making sure, helping people integrate all of these brain healthy modalities into their lifestyle, which then synergize with the training, giving people better results. And then also kind of laying down a foundation for good brain health once people finish the program, because I don't want people to be reliant on the neurotechnologies to have, good brain performance. It's, they can move the needle in the right direction, and they can kind of move the brain from good to great. But all of those foundational things are super essential in working with clients. So kind of like, that's kind of an overview of like what the program entails. And then to me, the coolest part, what we do at the very end, is the follow-up brain map. So whereas the initial brain map is more of, getting that initial baseline, helping us design a personalized brain training protocol, the follow-up brain map enables us to actually track someone's progress. So, you could subjectively be feeling better, going through the program. Maybe you feel like you're happier and you feel more focused and your sleep's better, and that's great. But I think it's so validating for a lot of people when they see the objective data that matches up to their experience, where it's like, oh, okay, my brain initially, these were the areas that were problematic. This is the way it looked. And now doing the follow-up scan, oh, wow, all these areas have improved and I feel way better. So it kind of validates what people are feeling. And I think also helps, when they share those results with their friends or family, it helps people really understand a lot more how these different issues are oftentimes biological problems rather than people just, being lazy or, kind of like having issues with their willpower. So that's, I really think like the doing the follow-up brain maps are the coolest, to me, the coolest part of the whole process.
Yeah, that's amazing. And just to go off of what you were just saying, there's so many different things that people are dealing with today, right? And I can speak, just as somebody who is obsessed with being the best and reaching and living in optimal performance. Like, I'm always thinking about what could I be doing better? What could I be doing better? Where am I deficient in terms of my focus and my performance and memory and recall, cognition, all of these things. And, there's a lot of men out there. I know this whole, anti, or just perhaps becoming more aware around porn, for example, and other addictions and depression and anxiety. A lot of these topics are coming to the forefront, and people are having this, more vulnerable discussions around a lot of these things that they're struggling with. And that's to be admired. And I'm so glad that people are addressing a lot of these imbalances. But to the point that you were making, it's like, it's not who you are. It's an imbalance. It's a distortion, and the brain is like a chemical factory. And if we can tweak and pull and reformulate those levers, if we are constantly falling into YouTube rabbit holes or seeking mindless distractions to get that quick dopamine hit, all that may be needed is to create a new habit so that we're getting that from value additive or beneficial sources, or from business, or from reading, or something like that. And it's just a matter of making those adjustments.
Most definitely. And I just want to add on to that. I agree with everything you said there. I think when it comes to, someone dealing with like a physical health problem, if someone breaks their leg, it's very easy to see, they're walking around in a cast, like people have plenty of empathy for them, right? Whereas if someone gets a concussion and, they're walking around and they notice, some personality changes and memory loss and all these things, but they look normal. They look completely the same. So it's oftentimes they don't get that same empathy, as someone with a physical condition. But, inflammation is something that affects the body. It also affects the brain. We can see when our joints are inflamed. We can't see when our brain is inflamed. So the imaging, being able to actually measure what's going on in the brain is really the only way we can actually help people understand what's driving their biological brain symptoms.
I want to talk about brain foods for a moment. I use MCT oil, usually liquefied or in coconut powder form, caffeine in moderation, water, fruits. Are there any other foods that, particularly maybe lesser known or lesser discussed, that you like or that you recommend that people look to mix into their diet to optimize their brain functionality?
When it comes to food, honestly, the first place I start is, what are people eating that they need to remove? So a lot of people, the things that cause a lot of inflammation in the brain that people eat a ton of, sugar, processed foods. For some people who are sensitive, well, really dairy and gluten cause inflammation in most people. It's just certain people are more sensitive and notice, bigger changes. But I just always start with like removing, what can we remove that's sort of limiting people's performance.
Okay.
But when it comes to foods to add on, I really focus on healthy fats. So I love the MCT oil. I incorporate that myself, and with most of my clients, I'm always recommending the MCT oil. I would say avocados, grass-fed butter. I'm a big fan of meat. I know Yeah, a lot of these things, like we've been told, are bad, and pasture, or that fat is bad for us. But in reality, our brain is composed about 70 to 75% of fat. The
Okay.
myelin sheaths that insulate our neurons that allow us to have quick cognition, these are composed of fat. So in order to really have a high performance brain, you need to be consuming a lot of healthy fats. So also fish oil, your omega-3, the fatty acids, super crucial. So if you're not a big fan of fish, like I don't really like too much fish besides salmon. So I make sure to supplement with a high potency omega-3 fish oil supplement. Krill oil is also great.
Yeah.
When it comes to other foods, I'm a huge fan of eggs. I think eggs are great for the brain. They contain a lot of vitamins, minerals. They contain choline, which is a precursor to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is essential for learning, memory, and overall cognition.
Okay.
So, just eating foods that are low inflammatory, that give us the healthy fats, they help stabilize our blood sugar. Those are really the best for our brain health, because really there's a lot of research on blood sugar spikes. There's more and more research every day on the effects of how blood sugar spikes actually impact our brain health and mental health. So much to the point that some researchers are actually calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, because there's such a strong connection between the elevated blood sugar that people get from consuming a diet full of processed carbs. So that wreaks havoc on the brain long term, but it also causes short term problems and inflammation. There's a woman, this biochemist, Dr. Jessie, I'm going to butcher her last name, but she goes by the Glucose Goddess on Instagram, and recommend, all your listeners check her out. She has great material, but she talks a lot about how, she was able to kind of cure her own mental illness with basically, maintaining stable blood sugar levels. Because when people have these spikes in blood sugar from, say, eating, a breakfast full of carbs, full of donuts, and putting sugar sweeteners in their coffee, they spike their blood sugar, and then you have that temporary little period of energy, but
Right.
then you crash and your mental performance crashes. So really stabilizing your blood sugar, people think a lot about that in terms of diabetes and kind of their physical health, but I think we're going to hear more and more in the next coming years about the effects that stabilizing and maintaining a healthy blood sugar has on our mental health and our brain performance.
Okay. And as we wrap up here, Toby, why should people care about improving their brain health and their mental performance? I think for a lot of people like you and I, it's evident, it's self-evident, but for those that maybe haven't thought about this, or are just now getting into some biohacking or personal wellness practices, like what's the ultimate end game, or what's the main benefits that they should be really aiming towards?
Well, your brain is in charge of your success or your lack of success in anything you do. So it doesn't really matter whether you're an entrepreneur trying to build, a big business, whether, you're a stay-at-home mom wanting to just be a great mother. It doesn't really matter where you're at in life. Like the health of your brain directly translates into the success that you have in any endeavor. So we live in, honestly, I think the coolest time period right now, where we have so much neuroscience and psychology. We have all of these tools at our disposal, and we know now that we actually can improve the health of our brain. Whereas, if we were having this conversation, Michael, if we were having this conversation 30, 40 years ago, and we didn't really know about neuroplasticity, and we kind of thought, it doesn't really matter, our lifestyle habits, like it's not really going to affect our brains, and we're kind of just stuck with the brains that we were born with, then, none of what I do would exist. None of this would even matter. But the fact that we live in a time period where we now know, how we can actually, biohack our brains, neurohack, and incorporate all of these different tools such as meditation, exercise, sunlight exposure, how all of these things, oftentimes natural interventions, Fasting is another thing that we didn't touch on, but fasting has a huge, powerful effect on people's, brain activity, brain performance. So I think just being able to like leverage all of these modalities is going to improve people's success in whatever they do and help them actually enjoy the process more. They're going to be happier, healthier, and wealthier in whatever they're choosing to do with their lives.